Now let's look at each of these skills in more detail, starting with introducing. When you quote, you want to prepare your reader to grasp its significance by explaining who is speaking and in what context. In its most basic form, introducing starts with clearly attributing authorship. For example, by writing John Muir states or Muir explains that as a kind of lead-in to the quotation. Now that last part, as a lead-in to the quotation, is really important because if you don't actually name your author in the same sentence where you begin to quote, it's really easy to confuse your reader. Now, sometimes students hesitate to blend their introductory remarks this way because they're confused about how to connect them. So let me give you a few basic rules on how to use punctuation when you fuse your own words with theirs. If you're introducing with some version of he or she says, use a comma to connect your introduction with the quotation. If the quoted material is already meshed with your own words, then you don't need to use a comma. Here's an example. Now, you would not put a comma here between as and a worthy object if you weren't quoting, so you don't need to just because there's a quotation mark there. In short, only use a comma to introduce a quote when the syntax would normally require it, or when you use some version of says right before the quoted material. Finally, use a colon instead of a comma when you're announcing quotations that are more than one sentence or for quotes longer than 4 lines. For example, if you were to write, Stanton declared the right is ours, have it we must, use it we will, you would use the colon, even though this is a short quotation, because this quotation is more than 1 sentence long. If your quotation is longer than 4 lines, you should also introduce it with a colon. And in this case, you want to take the additional step of transforming it into a block quotation. Now you make block quotations by indenting the entire quotation, single spacing, and by omitting the quotation marks. This might be surprising, but you don't need those quotation marks anymore because the block tells you that it's a quote. Now it's important to know how to form block quotations because there will be times when you can't avoid presenting a large chunk of text. You should be aware, however, that it's generally considered better to use short, edited quotations when you can, and particularly in a short history essay. So it's important to clearly connect your authors with their words. But in history writing, the author's not just a name. An author is a person acting in a particular place and in a particular time. So in addition to naming authors, historians often introduce their quotations with context about the writer and their circumstances. In our case, for example, the writer noted that John Muir was the founder of the Sierra Club, that this article was written in 1908, and that the motivation for writing the article was the damming of the Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. So let's look at our quotation now that the author has been properly introduced to see what else we could do to sharpen its focus. So we've added some contextual details about the author to orient the reader, and we've blended these with the beginning of the quotation by cutting the confusing word nevertheless. But there's still some problems here. First, the quote is still too long. It contains so much information that the reader isn't really sure what they're supposed to be focusing on. And two, even though we've gotten rid of the confusing word nevertheless, there are still parts of this quotation that are out of context and that make it hard to follow. Now, in order to prevent these problems, experienced quoters often chop up longer quotations and blend the smaller bits with their own words. The guidelines for doing this kind of editing are very simple. 1, keep the words that are important to proving your assertion and cut those that would distract you from your main point. 2, don't change the meaning of the original quotation in the process of doing this. So you always want to start when you're cutting by asking, what's my purpose here? What am I using this quotation to show? In this case, the writer wants to suggest that John Muir portrayed the profit motive as an evil, insipid force that would inevitably exploit the natural parks if it isn't stopped. Which words do we need to keep to illustrate that argument? Well, we're interested in Muir's demonization of the lumbermen and the ranchers, so let's keep these words that connect them to Satan and that designate the parks as a sacred temptation for evil. But we can eliminate the parenthetical, like everything else worthwhile. It's really just a distracting aside. Certainly, we want to keep despoiling gain seekers, since that designates the profit motive. But then we could probably omit what follows, mischief makers of every degree, because it clutters up the sentence without adding anything that we need. And finally, let's keep the memorable expression smiling philanthropy, which underscores the deviousness of the profiteers' encroachments on nature. However, we'll cut the rest so we can introduce smiling philanthropy more flexibly using our own words. The result, once you've supplied the connective tissue by summarizing or paraphrasing what Muir said in your own words, is something like this. In his 1908 defense of Yosemite's Hetch Hetchy Valley, for example, Sierra Club founder John Muir explained that however sacred and precious the national parks seemed, despoiling gain seekers from Satan to supervisors, lumbermen, cattlemen, and farmers would still try to exploit them under the pretense of smiling philanthropy. Weaving short quotations into your own wording solves many of the problems you face when quoting. Sometimes, however, you still need to alter the author's original wording to make it mesh with your own, or to clarify something in its meaning. In these situations, you can use ellipses or brackets to show where you've changed the original text. You can use ellipses, or those 3 dots, to edit out unnecessary or inconvenient language. In our citation, for example, the writer has edited out mischief makers of every degree, along with the dash, because they make an already long sentence just a bit too choppy. When you edit quotes like this, just be sure not to change their original meaning in the process. You can also use square brackets to make minor changes to help the quotations better fit your own wording. Here's an example. In the original quotation, despoiling isn't capitalized, but it has to be to start this sentence. So the writer has indicated the change by putting the capital D in brackets. Similarly, she chose to add an and in brackets before farmers and delete the etc. that Muir ended with. Let me conclude by emphasizing that introducing and blending quotations are skills that take practice, but you'll get the hang of it as long as you remember these few basic principles. 1. Introduce your authors. As simple as it sounds, we really need to know who is speaking, and the first time you introduce them, we need to know a bit about who they were and why they were writing. 2nd, chop your quotations. Edit long quotations down to the smaller bits that you really need to prove your case. This not only focuses your reader's attention on your argument, it also makes it easier for you to solve some of the problems that raw quotations pose when you insert them into your own prose. 3. Blend quotes grammatically. Don't hesitate to use paraphrasing, ellipses, or brackets to help you smooth the connection between the original text and your own writing.